The $60 million deal could wait. Michael Richardson pushed through his mahogany office doors, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble floors as he rushed toward the elevator. In 23 years of building his empire, he had never left a board meeting for anything. But today, something in his 8-year-old daughter's voice during that brief phone call made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar urgency. The penthouse elevator climbed silently toward the 40th floor, carrying him toward a discovery that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his carefully controlled world. Because when Michael Richardson opened his front door 30 minutes later, the person he found sitting at his kitchen table, calmly braiding his daughter's hair, was someone who shouldn't exist in their lives, someone who would force him to question everything he believed about family, loyalty, and the price of success. The Richardson Technologies building stretched 47 floors into the Manhattan sky, its glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun like a monument to corporate success. On the 46th floor, Michael Richardson commanded his empire from behind a desk that cost more than most people's annual salary. At 42, he had built his software company from a college dorm room idea into a billion-dollar enterprise. But today, the numbers on his laptop screen blurred as his mind drifted to places he usually kept locked away. His wife Sarah's photograph sat at the corner of his desk, captured in a moment of laughter from their vacation in Tuscany 4 years ago. 2 years had passed since cancer took her away, leaving Michael to navigate single fatherhood while running a company that demanded 18-hour days. He had spent their marriage climbing toward success, promising Sarah that someday they would have all the time in the world, only to discover that time was the one thing money couldn't buy. "Mr. Richardson, the board is waiting for your final decision on the Hartwell acquisition." His assistant, Janet, appeared in the doorway with practiced patience that came from 15 years of managing his schedule. Michael straightened his silk tie and pushed Sarah's photograph face down, a habit he had developed whenever business called. The boardroom buzzed with the energy of men and women who measured their worth in market shares and quarterly profits. Michael took his seat at the head of the polished oak table, commanding immediate attention. "The Hartwell acquisition represents everything we've worked toward," Michael began, his voice carrying the authority that had closed hundreds of deals. "Their distribution network will give us access to markets we've only dreamed of reaching." His phone buzzed against the mahogany table, the vibration cutting through his presentation. Michael's rule was absolute: no interruptions during board meetings. But the caller ID made his blood freeze. Lincoln Elementary School. Sophie. His 8-year-old daughter, the one person in the world who could make his carefully constructed priorities crumble with a single phone call. The room fell silent as 20 of the most powerful people in the tech industry watched their CEO take a call during the most important meeting of the quarter. "Daddy?" Sophie's voice was small, scared, and it cut through Michael's chest like a blade. "Can you come home? There's someone here, and Mrs. Patterson doesn't know what to do." Mrs. Patterson was their housekeeper, efficient but never showing particular warmth toward Sophie. The fact that she was turning to an 8-year-old for guidance suggested a situation beyond her professional expertise. "Who's there, sweetheart?" Michael asked, already rising from his chair, his mind shifting from quarterly projections to parental protection mode. "I don't know her name," Sophie whispered. "But Daddy, she knows about Mummy. She knows things about Mummy that I never heard before." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Sarah had been gone for 2 years, and they had talked extensively about her life. The idea that a stranger possessed knowledge about his wife that he didn't triggered a protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. "I'm coming home right now," Michael said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Stay with Mrs. Patterson, don't talk to this person, and I'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call and looked around the boardroom at 20 faces that represented billions in combined wealth. These people had flown in from around the world for this meeting. The Hartwell deal would close the largest acquisition in Richardson Technologies' history, and walking away now would send ripples through the industry. "Gentlemen, ladies," Michael said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, "we'll need to reconvene tomorrow morning. Something has come up that requires my immediate attention." Richard Caldwell, the board's chairman and Michael's former mentor, leaned forward with concern. "Michael, this acquisition has been 18 months in the making. The Hartwell people are expecting an answer today. If we delay, there's a real chance they'll walk away." Michael gathered his papers with movements that were precise but hurried. "Nothing is more important than my daughter," Michael said, the words carrying a weight that surprised even him. "We'll meet first thing tomorrow morning, and I'll have an answer for you then." The ride to his penthouse normally took 40 minutes in Manhattan traffic, but today, every red light felt like an eternity. Michael found himself gripping the leather seat, his knuckles white with tension as he imagined scenarios that grew more alarming with each passing minute. Who would have access to his building, to his home, to his daughter? The penthouse security was military grade, designed to keep the world at bay. The fact that someone had penetrated those defenses and somehow gained Sophie's trust suggested either a security breach of unprecedented proportions or something far more complicated. As the elevator climbed toward the 40th floor, Michael's reflection stared back at him from the polished steel doors. At 42, success had carved lines around his eyes that spoke of late nights and early mornings, of decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in revenue. Sarah used to joke that he aged in corporate years, like dog years, but measured in quarterly reports and board meetings. Michael's key turned in the lock with a click that seemed unnaturally loud. As he pushed open the door, he expected to find Mrs. Patterson waiting with explanations, Sophie hiding behind her protective bulk. Instead, he stepped into a scene that stopped him cold, his briefcase dropping from suddenly numb fingers to hit the marble floor. In his kitchen, at the breakfast table where he and Sophie shared hurried morning meals, sat a woman he had never seen before. She appeared to be in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and hands that spoke of years of honest work. Her clothes were clean but clearly inexpensive, practical garments worn by someone who valued function over fashion. She was gently braiding Sophie's long blonde hair, her movements patient and practiced, while his daughter sat perfectly still with a contentment Michael hadn't seen since Sarah's death. The domestic intimacy of the scene hit Michael like a physical blow. This stranger was performing the kind of maternal ritual that had died with his wife, the gentle moments of connection that he had never learned to provide. Sophie's face glowed with a happiness that made Michael's chest tighten. She looked more relaxed, more genuinely at peace than she had in 2 years. "Sophie, step away from her," Michael commanded, his voice cutting through the domestic tranquility like a blade. Both females turned toward him, and the stranger's eyes met his with a directness that was both unsettling and strangely familiar. There was no fear in her gaze, no guilt at being discovered in his home without permission. Instead, she looked at him with something that resembled recognition. "Hello, Michael?" she said quietly, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't place. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I think it's time we talked." The woman continued braiding Sophie's hair, as if his presence hadn't changed anything. Her fingers moved with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of practice, and Sophie remained perfectly still, as if she had been receiving this attention for months rather than minutes. "I don't care who you are," Michael said, his voice rising with each word. "You're in my home, with my daughter, without permission. I'm calling security, and then I'm calling the police." But even as he reached for his phone, Sophie turned in her chair with an expression that stopped him cold. Her blue eyes were filled with desperate pleading that cut through his anger. This was not the face of a child in danger, but rather the expression of someone who had found something precious and feared losing it. "Please don't, Daddy," Sophie whispered, her small hand reaching toward him. "She's not bad. She knew Mommy. She knows stories about Mommy that you never told me." The words hit Michael harder than any corporate betrayal. The idea that someone possessed knowledge of his wife that he didn't, that his daughter was learning things about her mother from a stranger, triggered emotions that he had spent 2 years trying to suppress. "How do you know my wife?" Michael asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "What do you want from us?" Elena finished the braid and secured it with a hair tie from her wrist, a gesture so natural it spoke of dozens of repetitions. She helped Sophie turn around in the chair, and for a moment Michael was struck by how right the scene looked, how much it resembled the morning routines he and Sarah had shared when Sophie was younger. "I know Sarah because she was my daughter," Elena said simply, the words dropping into the kitchen's silence like stones into still water. "And Sophie is my granddaughter." The room seemed to tilt around Michael as the implications sank in. Sarah's parents had died in a car accident when she was 19, a tragedy that had shaped her fierce independence. She had grieved their deaths throughout their marriage, had visited their graves faithfully, had shared stories of their love and sacrifice. The idea that she had been lying about something so fundamental challenged everything he thought he knew about the woman he had married. "That's impossible," Michael said, but even as the words left his mouth, he found himself studying Eleanor's features with new intensity. The bone structure was similar, the way she held her head when she spoke, certain gestures that seemed hauntingly familiar. "Sarah's parents died 23 years ago. She told me about the accident, showed me the death certificates." Elena's expression softened with understanding mixed with deep sadness. She reached into a worn leather purse and withdrew a photograph, its edges soft with age. She placed it on the table between them, and Michael found himself looking at an image that made his breath catch. It was Sarah at perhaps 25, radiant in a way that spoke of happiness and hope. But it wasn't a photograph Michael recognized. She was standing beside a man Michael had never seen before, their arms around each other with casual intimacy. But what stopped Michael's heart was the realization that the photo had been taken years after Sarah's supposed parents had died, and she was clearly, visibly pregnant. "Sarah was my daughter," Elena repeated, her voice gentle but firm. "And 3 months before she married you, she was married to someone else. She was carrying his child when he died in Afghanistan." The photograph trembled in Michael's hands as the implications crashed over him. Sarah had hidden an entire previous existence. A first husband, a first pregnancy, a first love that had ended in tragedy so profound that she had created an entirely new identity to escape it. Sophie slipped down from her chair and moved to stand beside Elena, her small hand finding the older woman's with natural trust. The gesture was simple, innocent, but it represented a connection that threatened to upend everything Michael thought he knew about his family. "That baby died," Elena continued, her voice thick with old grief. "Sarah lost the child at 6 months, and the grief almost destroyed her. She blamed me for encouraging her to marry so young, for not protecting her from heartbreak. She said I had failed her as a mother, that I had let her believe in fairy tales when I should have prepared her for reality." Michael set the photograph down with shaking hands, his mind racing through 20 years of marriage, searching for signs he had missed. Sarah's occasional nightmares, her fierce protectiveness of Sophie, her reluctance to talk about her past. He had attributed these things to losing her parents so young, but now he wondered what other explanations might exist. "She changed her name," Elena said. "Sarah Elena Vasquez became Sarah Matthews. She moved to New York, created new identification papers, built a new life from nothing. She was so angry, so hurt, that she wanted to erase every trace of the person she had been." The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, walls closing in around them. Michael had built his success on information, on understanding every variable in the equations that governed his business empire. The revelation that his wife had concealed an entire previous existence challenged his fundamental understanding of truth and trust. "Why are you telling me this now?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah died 2 years ago. What possible purpose could this serve?" Elena's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Because Sarah reached out to me 3 months before she died. She was scared, Michael. She knew the cancer was going to win, and she was terrified of leaving Sophie alone. She begged me to watch over her granddaughter, to be the family she would need when her father was too busy to notice her pain." The words hit Michael like physical blows, each revelation adding weight to guilt he hadn't even known he was carrying. He thought of the last months of Sarah's illness, the way he had thrown himself into work as a way of coping with approaching loss, the way he had convinced himself that providing financially was the best way to show love. The nights he had stayed late at the office, the business trips he hadn't cancelled, the moments he had missed because he couldn't bear to watch the woman he loved fade away. "She said you were a good man, but that success had become your language of love," Elena continued, her voice gentle but uncompromising. "She was afraid that after she died, you would try to buy Sophie's happiness instead of giving her your presence. She asked me to step in if that happened." Michael's vision blurred as the truth crashed over him. In the 2 years since Sarah's death, he had indeed tried to solve his daughter's grief with gifts and experiences, expensive private schools and exclusive camps, anything that money could buy. But he had failed to provide the one thing she needed most, a parent who was emotionally present. "How long have you been watching us?" Michael asked, though part of him already knew the answer would cut deep. "I've been the cleaning lady in your building for 18 months, Elena said simply. Elena from the overnight maintenance crew, invisible to everyone who matters, but with access to places where important people live their real lives. The revelation hit Michael like a sledgehammer. For 18 months, his daughter's grandmother had been cleaning the hallways he walked, emptying the trash from his office, invisible in the way that service workers always were to people like him. She had been watching Sophie grow up from a distance, seeing the loneliness that expensive toys couldn't heal. "You've been spying on us," Michael said, anger rising in his voice. "You've been manipulating this situation." "To what?" Elena interrupted, her voice carrying steel. "To clean up after your messes? To hold your daughter when she cries because her daddy is always too busy? To teach her how to braid her hair because no one else will?" Sophie began to cry quietly, the adult tensions finally overwhelming her 8-year-old understanding. She pressed herself against Elena's side, seeking comfort from the one person in the room who represented stability and warmth. "Sophie, come here," Michael said, extending his arms toward his daughter, but she shook her head and held more tightly to Elena. "She's not bad, Daddy," Sophie said through her tears. "She makes me sandwiches the way Mommy used to, and she reads me stories, and she doesn't look at her phone all the time like you do." Each word was a dart finding its target, exposing truths that Michael had been avoiding for 2 years. He had become exactly what Sarah had feared, a father who provided everything except himself, who substituted material abundance for emotional availability. Elena stood slowly, her movements careful and dignified, and Michael realized she was preparing to leave. The thought filled him with panic that surprised him. This woman represented a connection to Sarah that he didn't understand, knowledge about his wife that he desperately needed, and perhaps most importantly, a relationship with Sophie that his daughter clearly treasured. "Wait," Michael said, the word coming out more desperately than he had intended. "Don't go. I need to understand." Elena paused at the kitchen doorway, Sophie still pressed against her side. Sarah wanted you to know that love isn't something you earn through achievement, Michael. It's something you give through presence. She wanted Sophie to have a grandmother who would teach her that she was worthy of love just for existing, not for what she accomplished. The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of 2 years' worth of missed connections and misunderstood priorities. Michael looked around his expensive kitchen, with its granite countertops and professional-grade appliances, and suddenly saw it through Sophie's eyes. It was beautiful, but it was cold. It was impressive, but it wasn't warm. "What did Sarah tell you about me?" Michael asked, his voice small in a way that his board of directors had never heard. Elena's expression softened, and for the first time, Michael caught a glimpse of the woman who had raised the girl he had fallen in love with. She said you were the kindest man she had ever met, but that you had forgotten how to be kind to yourself. She said you worked so hard to provide for your family that you forgot to be part of it. And she said that if anything happened to her, you would need someone to remind you that Sophie didn't need a perfect father. She just needed her father. The truth of those words cut through Michael's defenses like a surgeon's blade, precise and necessary and devastating. He had spent 2 years trying to be the perfect widowed father, managing his grief like a business problem that could be solved through proper resource allocation. But children didn't need strategic planning. They needed bedtime stories and braided hair and sandwiches that made them smile. "I don't know how to do this," Michael admitted, the confession costing him more than any business failure ever had. "I don't know how to be the father she needs. I've built my whole life around solving problems with money and power, but this is something I can't buy or control." Elena released Sophie gently and walked back to where Michael stood. When she looked up at him, he saw Sarah's eyes, the same green depths that had captured his heart 20 years earlier. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable, and he wondered how he had missed it. "The first thing you need to understand," Elena said quietly, "is that you don't have to do this alone. Sarah sent me here because she knew that healing happens in community, not in isolation. She wanted Sophie to have family, real family, not just the memory of what family used to be." Michael found himself nodding, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. The afternoon had upended everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and his role as a father. But perhaps that destruction was necessary before something new and better could be built from the ruins. "Will you stay?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of surrender. "Will you help me learn how to do this right?" Elena smiled for the first time since he had arrived, and the expression transformed her face into something radiant and familiar. It was Sarah's smile, the one that had convinced him that love was real and that happiness was possible. "I've been waiting 2 years for you to ask that question," Elena said. "Of course I'll stay." Sophie launched herself into Michael's arms with the kind of trust that children reserved for moments when the adult world finally made sense again. As he held his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and feeling the solid warmth of her small body, Michael realized that coming home early that day hadn't been an interruption of his real life. It had been the beginning of it. The phone in his pocket buzzed with what he knew would be messages from the office, updates on the Hartwell deal, reminders of the corporate empire that awaited his attention. But for the first time in 2 years, those demands felt secondary to the weight of his daughter in his arms and the possibility of a future built on presence rather than achievement. "Daddy," Sophie whispered against his shoulder, "can Elena teach you how to make sandwiches the way Mommy used to? I've been trying to remember, but I can't get them right." Michael looked over Sophie's head at Elena, who was watching them with patient attention that spoke of years spent observing from the margins, waiting for the right moment to step forward. She nodded slightly, and he understood that she was offering more than just sandwich-making lessons. She was offering to teach him how to be the father Sarah had believed he could become. "I think," Michael said, his voice thick with emotions he was finally allowing himself to feel, "that Elena is going to teach us both a lot of things." The weeks that followed transformed the Richardson household in ways Michael couldn't have imagined. Elena moved into the guest room with a single suitcase and a lifetime of stories about the daughter Michael thought he had known completely. She revealed gaps in his understanding that went far beyond Sarah's hidden past, showing him how Sarah used to hum while cooking, teaching Sophie the Spanish lullabies that Sarah had learned as a child, helping Michael see that his daughter had been grieving not just the loss of her mother, but the loss of a father who had retreated into work. "Grief shared is grief halved," Elena explained one evening after Sophie had gone to bed. "But grief avoided is grief doubled. You've been carrying twice the weight you needed to, Michael, because you've been carrying it alone." Michael made changes that rippled through their routine like stones thrown into still water. He started working from home 2 days a week, learned to braid Sophie's hair, though his attempts were clumsy, discovered that his daughter preferred bedtime stories about brave princesses who solved problems through kindness rather than conquest. The transformation wasn't immediate or without setbacks, but Elena was there for each failure, offering guidance without judgment. Michael hired a chief operating officer to handle day-to-day business operations, a decision that shocked his corporate circle but gave him something more valuable, time to discover who his daughter was becoming and who he wanted to be as her father. "People will think you're losing your edge," Richard Caldwell warned during a lunch meeting. "The market rewards intensity, Michael. Investors want to know that their CEO is fully committed to growth." Michael considered his mentor's words, weighing them against the memory of Sophie's laughter when he had spent Saturday morning teaching her to make pancakes. "I've been fully committed to growth," Michael replied, "but I've been growing in the wrong direction. The most important investment I can make isn't in market expansion. It's in making sure my daughter grows up knowing that she's loved for who she is, not what she achieves." Saturday mornings became sacred time for pancake experiments and cartoons, a ritual that Sophie treasured more than any expensive weekend getaway. Michael discovered that his daughter was funny, thoughtful, and surprisingly wise about adult relationships. "Elena says you and Mommy fell in love because you both believed in making things better," Sophie announced one evening as they worked on a jigsaw puzzle. "She says Mommy made people feel better, and you make companies work better, and that's why you were perfect together." The observation was so insightful that Michael paused to really look at his daughter. She had Sarah's eyes and her grandmother's wisdom, but she was developing a perspective uniquely her own. "What else does Elena tell you about your mom and me?" Sophie considered the question seriously. "She says Mommy was scared to love you at first because she thought you might leave like other people had left her. But you kept showing up, even when she was grumpy or sad, and that's how she knew you were different." The words hit Michael with unexpected force, carrying echoes of promises he had made during the early days of their relationship. He had won Sarah's love through consistency, through the daily choice to be present even when presence was challenging. It occurred to him that he had been trying to win Sophie's trust through grand gestures, rather than the steady accumulation of small moments that built real intimacy. "Your mom was very smart," Michael said, fitting a puzzle piece into place. "She knew that love isn't something you feel. It's something you do, day after day, choice after choice." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Is that why you're home more now? Because you're choosing to love me better?" The question was so direct, so free from emotional complications, that Michael felt his throat tighten. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm choosing to love you better." Elena's return from the grocery store interrupted their conversation, her arms full of ingredients for the Sunday dinner she had been planning. the kitchen filled with aromas of garlic and cumin, scents that transformed their sterile penthouse into something that felt like home. "Elena," Sophie called from the living room. "Daddy and I are talking about how to love people better. Do you want to help us?" Elena smiled and joined them at the puzzle table. "I think your daddy is figuring it out just fine," she said. "But I will say this. The best way to love someone is to pay attention to them. Not just to what they say, but to what they need, what makes them happy, what scares them." Michael looked around the table at these two females who had become the center of his world, realizing that Eleanor was describing exactly what had been missing from his approach to fatherhood. He had been paying attention to Sophie's external needs, but had missed the internal landscape where her real self was developing. "What makes you happy, Sophie?" he asked, treating the question as seriously as any strategic planning session. Sophie considered this with intensity. "I like it when people listen to my stories, even when they're not very interesting. I like it when you and Elena laugh at my jokes, even when they're not very funny. And I like it when we do things together that nobody is good at, so we're all learning at the same time." The answer revealed sophistication about human connection that impressed both adults. Sophie wasn't seeking admiration. She was seeking genuine engagement, authentic interaction that required vulnerability from all parties. "What scares you?" Elena asked gently. Sophie's expression grew serious. "I'm scared that Daddy will get so busy again that he'll forget how to be my daddy instead of just someone who pays for my stuff. And I'm scared that Elena will decide we don't need her anymore and go away like Mommy did." The fears were so reasonable, so grounded in Sophie's lived experience, that Michael felt simultaneously proud of her emotional intelligence and ashamed of the patterns that had created her anxiety. "Sophie," Michael said, reaching across the table to take her hand, "I want to make you a promise. I can't promise that I'll never have to work late, because sometimes my job requires that. But I can promise that you will always be more important to me than my work. And if you ever feel like I'm forgetting that, I want you to tell me right away." Sophie nodded, but her expression suggested that promises from adults were things she had learned to evaluate carefully. "What if you forget that you promised?" "Then Elena will remind me," he said, looking to the older woman for confirmation. "And if Elena forgets, then you can remind both of us. That's what families do. They help each other remember what's important." Elena nodded her agreement, and Michael saw in her expression the same commitment to Sophie's well-being that had driven her to infiltrate their building, to watch from the margins for 18 months, to risk everything to honor a promise made to her dying daughter. "Speaking of families," Elena said, her voice carrying weight that suggested important information was forthcoming, "there's something else Sarah wanted Sophie to know." Michael felt familiar anxiety, but Sophie leaned forward with eager attention, and he realized that his discomfort was less important than his daughter's need to understand her heritage. "Your mother had a brother," Elena said softly, watching Sophie's face. "His name was David, and he was 2 years younger than Sarah. He joined the army straight out of high school, just like her first husband, and he was killed in the same battle that made Sarah a widow." Sophie listened with solemn attention. "But you didn't make them go to war," she said finally, her voice carrying clear logic. "They chose to go because they wanted to help people, right?" Elena's eyes filled with tears at her granddaughter's simple wisdom. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. They chose to serve because I had raised them to believe that helping others was important, even when helping was dangerous. But your mother couldn't see it that way when she was hurting so badly." Michael struggled to process the magnitude of Sarah's losses. She had been widowed at 24, had lost a baby and a brother in the span of months, had blamed her mother for tragedies beyond anyone's control. The wonder wasn't that she had run away from her past. It was that she had found the courage to love again. "Sarah was braver than I ever understood," he said quietly. "She risked everything to create our family, knowing what it felt like to lose everything that mattered." Elena nodded, pride evident in her expression. "She was the strongest person I ever knew, but she was also the most scared. She loved you and Sophie with the intensity of someone who understood how precious and fragile happiness could be." As the months passed, the Richardson household settled into rhythms that honored both structure and spontaneity. Michael's leadership style evolved to emphasize collaboration rather than personal control, and the company's performance actually improved under the distributed model. Sophie thrived in the environment of consistent attention, her grades improving as her anxiety decreased. Elena became the bridge between past and present, sharing stories that kept Sarah's memory alive while helping them build new traditions. The transformation was neither instant nor perfect. Michael still struggled with the impulse to solve emotional problems through material solutions. Sophie occasionally tested boundaries. Elena sometimes worried about overstepping her role. But they had learned to address challenges through conversation rather than avoidance, to treat mistakes as learning opportunities. 1 year after Elena's dramatic appearance, Michael found himself reflecting on their strange journey. He was sitting in the same breakfast nook where he had first encountered his daughter's grandmother, but the atmosphere was completely different. Elena was helping Sophie practice Spanish vocabulary while pancakes cooked, classical music playing softly, the newspaper beside coffee that was still hot because he had time to enjoy it. "Daddy," Sophie said, looking up from her lesson. "Elena says that in Spanish, familia means more than just people who are related. It means people who take care of each other even when it's hard." Michael smiled at the definition, recognizing Eleanor's wisdom in choosing words that captured the essence of their unconventional but deeply committed relationship. They had become a family not through biological connection, but through the daily choice to show up for each other. "That's exactly right," Michael said, squeezing Sophie's hand. "And that's exactly what we are." As he watched his daughter and her grandmother return to their language lesson, Michael felt a contentment that had nothing to do with business achievements. He had learned that success could be measured in many ways, and the most important metrics couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. The laughter in his house, the trust in his daughter's eyes, the sense of purpose that came from being truly needed by people he loved, these were the returns that mattered most. The $60 million deal had eventually been completed with favorable terms, but Michael knew that the most valuable acquisition of his career would always be the afternoon when he had chosen to leave a board meeting early and discovered that sometimes the most important business happens at your own kitchen table, with people who see you not as a CEO or success story, but simply as a man trying to learn how to love well. The story of the single dad millionaire who came home early and couldn't believe what he saw had become something different by its conclusion. It was no longer the story of a man whose world was shattered by an unwelcome surprise, but rather the tale of a father who discovered that sometimes the most important discoveries happen not in boardrooms, but in the everyday moments when we choose to truly see the people who have been waiting patiently for us to come home.